In this video, I will continue to develop a specific critique of educational development by going through how the development of neoliberalism affects higher education and also the view of educational development. As higher education institutions want to guarantee that students receive, so to speak, value for money, there is a great demand that all educators should be able to provide them with high quality teaching. This is sometimes described as the term new public management, which focuses on how the public sector, which includes higher education, can be evaluated in a way that guarantees greater efficiency, success, and quality. This review then forms the basis for the funding of individual departments and universities, as well as for individual educators' salaries and promotion. The consequence for higher education has thus been that institutions of higher education and individual educators that they have been more or less forced to show through careful documentation that they actually produce results, in the sense that they provide courses that satisfied students who completed these courses, uh, who then go on to obtain their degrees. Or as two educational developers, Marie van der Kleut and Erin Aspenlida, described it, and I have a quote from them here. We lament that we wish we could be doing what we wish we could be doing: reading, discussion, planning, creating teaching experiences, or time to write reflectively rather than only productively. And yet, we are mindful that it is our productivity, measurable and ideally ever expanding, that elicits praise. We note that reporting how many workshops we lead or how many consultations we undertake draws approving nods about the impact of our work. There is rarely an opportunity to report on having read an interesting article. We've helped you to understand something you had been confused about, or to have been available to respond to a colleague's worries about future work. At the same time, when it is important to be able to measure quality, educational developers can serve as a way. Educational development can serve as a way through which higher education institutions can document their work towards better quality. Among other things, by creating structural conditions for educators not only to be able to develop their educational knowledge, but also requiring them to do so, it is possible to meet the demand that are imposed on universities and other institutions for higher education. A problem with this is that it creates a tick box culture in higher education, where educational development mainly takes place due to a demand to meet formal requirements within the organization to receive funding or promotion. Another problem is that the criteria for quality are often set by those, perhaps politicians, who do not necessarily have an active role in realizing the teaching locally. There is thus an imbalance between the demands that come from above and the individual and the local needs of active educators from below. Related to this, as I've already addressed, there is a risk that educators in higher education will start to associate educational development with something that you just have to do, an obligation that does not reflect the will of the educators themselves. The risk is then that educational development is perceived as a threat to the educators' autonomy, in other words, something that limits their academic freedom. If I summarize the criticism of educational development that I've developed in this and the previous video, it is that educational development, seen from a neoliberal perspective, risks distorting why it is important. It should not be important because there is a financial and a bureaucratic need to be able to document the development of university educators. Instead, it should be important because we, as educators, actually think it is important and believe that it develops the competencies that we need. But with the neoliberal paradigm, if we can describe this as such, uh, descriptions and understandings of educational development are dressed up in an economic language that reduces higher education to the perception of higher education to an economic transaction. So if we look at educational development from a neoliberal perspective, there is reason to ask, Why do we need uh, educational development at all? I don't know what you think, but I didn't become an educator to serve a bureaucratic apparatus that wants to streamline my output and that reduces students to consumers. Fortunately, if we ask active educators in higher education, perhaps such as yourselves, I think most of them would agree with me. They would argue that it is important that we all develop our educational abilities and knowledge, as we generally believe that teaching is an important part of higher education. Perhaps it can be argued that the educators have thus already embodied the ideal that I am calling for here. But there is still a risk that this will only be lip service. In practice, educators in higher education state that they do not have the time to prioritize educational development in their work, but must do this work in their spare time. It also worth pointing out that active educators in higher education still tend to value research over teaching. That is understandable. Many who teach at universities applied there to become a researcher first, but then more or less had to start teaching as part of their positions when it was required of them. What is then often as absurd is that the time that could have been spent on educational development ultimately went to research. So even if some educators state that they want to become a better educator, they don't always prioritize educational development. In conclusion, I do not mean to say that educational development is unnecessary or always only, so to speak, neoliberal in its design. I still think it's important because education is important. So while there are reasons to ask why we should become better educators, there are also reasons to ask how to become better educators. So, and we will do this in the next video lectures, where I will go through 5 perspectives of teams that we will be seeing reoccurringly in the program. Let's call this a kind of introduction to these teams that you will encounter during the program. So see you in the next videos.